Welcome to another book review by Kyron. Today I have the book for you, Scale by Geoffrey West. So this book was published in 2017 and it's a compilation of his studies in biology at the Santa Fe Institute, which is in California, I believe. But from a physics background. So he was initially a physicist who did a lot of work in that area. Then had some ideas and wanted to know more about, I suppose, biology and sort of somewhat switched profession, but came at biology with a physics sort of viewpoint. So that's why his book is, I guess, like unique to him because not many people do that sort of transition. It's the scaling of organisms. So this would be, and similar entities. So this would be of animals, of companies, and of cities in the major part, independent of their size. So he wants to sort of find out what are the universal laws of scaling, and are there things where, even if you have an ant, is it going to be the same, or a mouse, is it going to be the same as something the size of an elephant? What are the similarities and what things transition well between these two animals or things of very different size? So some of the themes of the book gives you an introduction to scaling. So I have here a Rubik's Cube, and one of the things you'll notice is, I guess, the scale of it is not dependent of exactly what you're measuring. So I suppose if you had one cube, so one little corner, it would be one dimension long, the area would be 1, and the volume would be 1 because it's 1 by 1 by 1. If you increase that to 2, it would be 2 length units long, so it's doubled, but the area would be 4, so it'd be 2 by 2, which is 4, and the volume would be 2 by 2 by 2, 2 by 2 by 2, yeah, right, 8. So you can see with these little things that even though these dimensions all are the same, I guess, so there's like length, area, and volume, they do not scale in the same way if they double, if one of them increases, I guess. So that's where you can see it follows like a superlinear path. So the volume of it is not, even though the scale of it, the length of it might double, the volume like octuples, how do you say that? Like goes up by a factor of 8. So he's trying to find very similar laws, but with regards to animals, with regards to cities and companies in particular. So some of the themes from the book, there's increasing returns to scale, which is superlinear, and economy of scale, which is sublinear. So you'll see this in companies. So as a company grows and grows and grows, they have an economy of scale where to produce a unit of, let's just say, a globe, it would take $10. But if they're able to produce 100 units of these globes, it would cost $8 for them to produce. So that's where there's this economy as something grows bigger, the effects of it can sort of decrease in a sense. Then in the opposite way as well, if something's increasing, the returns from it can also increase. So, and that's called superlinear. There are some universal laws he found, and this is the part of the book that I found really interesting right at the start, which is, for example, for animals, in particular mammals, basically every single one of them has 1.5 billion heartbeats in a lifetime. So even though a mouse will only live for a couple of years, that is sort of because its heart is beating 1.5 million times. So their hearts are beating probably like 200, 300 times a minute. If you compare that to a human, which lives for 80 years, and we have heartbeat of, I guess, between 60 to 100, something around that range. And then even the longer living animals, such as whales, which can live, past 100 years. I think there's even some whales that get up to 150 years. And their heartbeats, even though they're a gigantic, huge animal, their heartbeats don't occur as rapidly. So they'd probably be in, like 40 beats per minute or something like that. Fractals. But one of the things actually that humans have managed to do is increase our average heartbeats to 2.5 billion. And that is through the use of like science and medicine and whatnot. to actually sort of break this universal law. But if you look at all other mammals, they all basically hit this same line around the 1.5 billion. So, kudos to humans. Fractals and the growth curve of animals. So I'll put up a little picture somewhere around here where you can see the growth curve of basically all animals follows a very similar thing. Very rapid progression at the start as far as in terms of size and you think of any single animal, they obviously start off as a baby and then grow up to a fully mature animal. And even though this happens across different time scales and different periods and different sizes, if you can take the dimensionless time and the dimensionless weight, you'll see that they all follow a very, very similar curve. And so that's what he's trying to do here. He's not trying to find, this is exactly the same between a mouse and a human. He's trying to say, look, if you take this dimensionless time and this dimensionless mass, these things are going to be very, very similar. How he actually got those, you'd have to dive deep into like the notes and the bibliography of the book. I didn't do that, but it was interesting to see that there are some universal things. So applying this knowledge to cities and companies. So he basically starts off with like the biology of animals and then tries to say, okay, from here, this is how I'm going to apply it to cities and companies, and these are the sort of things I find. So a couple of things from that was, I guess, if you look at like a city, the networks that they all have, as far as where like smaller suburbs are placed, how the endpoints are all the same, of as far as like the branching of the roads and the interconnectedness between different people in the city. It all sort of seems to be roughly similar, and I'll get through some of these. So he's got a couple of, core principles for networks and allometric scaling. One of these is space filling. So it must service all the local subunits. So even though you have like a house out in Whoop Whoop, it's still got to have roads connecting to it. It's still got to have electricity, water lines, and power. So even though it won't have, I guess, like all the best amenities and whatnot, there's parts of systems which fill out space to get out to them. So even though you have an individual perhaps making a silly decision of where they want to place a house, say they want to put it in, I don't know, the side of a cliff or something, usually there's going to be some sort of way that they are connected to everyone else from that. Another one of these network principles is the invariance of terminal units. So you'll see for animals, the blood vessels that go through all of us, the capillaries end in a certain size that doesn't really get any smaller. So even though the heart of a whale will have a giant tube this big pumping blood through it initially, as it gets to the terminal points, the cells like deep into its body, you'll find that it's got the same width as a blood vessel that goes to our terminal units as well. A more concrete example of this would be a light switch, or like the electrical outlet. It doesn't matter if you have a home that's one story and one bedroom, it's going to have an electrical outlet that's, say, this big. You can have a giant mega tall skyscraper, their electrical outlets are still going to be this big. They don't scale to these, giant sized, room sized electrical outlets. So there's something about a terminal, a principal endpoint that carries through into different genres, from companies to cities to animals. The last one of these was the optimization. So the principle of least action chosen among all the configurations. And I think this ties into a little bit of the terminal units point. So basically the reason we have electrical outlets that are, say the size of my fist, is because that's like the optimal way of doing it. Maybe there are some very small changes that could be made, but I don't think having a outlet the size of a pinhead is really going to work for everyone. And the same, we're not going to have outlets the size of a car or something. It's probably centered around one of the facts that for us it's best, like the optimization of that is best because it's roughly the size of a hand and we can stick things in relatively easy. So that's one of the interesting things I found from the book. And the book starts off very strong with a lot of interesting questions on page 6. I'll read through some of them here. Why can we live up to 120 years but not for 1,000 or 1,000,000? Why do mice made of pretty much the same stuff as we are live for just 2 to 3 years, whereas elephants live up to 75? Why do we stop growing? Why do we have to sleep for 8 hours every day? Why do we get relatively far fewer tumors than mice, but whales get almost none? So he's got a lot of questions he tries to answer in this book. And I suppose one of the things is that he sets himself up for a failure a little bit, because I feel he tries to answer too much and or like proposes too much and doesn't really concretely answer this is what this is. So I felt like he didn't really adequately answer why do we sleep for 8 hours per day. You could probably write a whole book on that, but I think adding that in, it sort of took away a little bit from me the enjoyment of reading, because I'm expecting like all these answers, like a neat, tidy way of closing off all these things he proposes, but it doesn't really get to that. There are some more interesting things though. For example, the theory for expanding lifespan I found very intriguing. It's in the pages 202 to 207 if you ever get the book. Basically, there's a couple of things he proposes. One is that lifespan is inversely proportional to the metabolic rate per unit mass, which is basically like the lifespan increases, exponentially increases as temperature decreases. So if you somehow manage to get your body to operate at 1 degree less, you would theoretically be able to live for 10 to 15% longer. Just because, I suppose a good analogy is a train. If you had a train that's just running all the time, going flat out, like white knuckling it, it's going to break down. It's going to have disaster and I suppose like end in tragedy. Whereas if you had a train which was used adequately, replaced parts adequately, it would have a much, much longer lifespan. Another couple of things. The heartbeats for 1.5 billion, but for humans, we've managed to get it to 2.5 billion. So if somehow we manage to, through meditation perhaps, slow your heart rate down or decrease your heart rate by 10% each day, the number of beats beating, you'd theoretically be able to live for 10% longer. Caloric restriction as well decreases the cellular metabolic rate and therefore decreases the damage per cell. So that's one of the other things. He's basically saying if you can survive on a smaller number of calories, you can sort of extend that out for a longer period of time as well. Getting into the meat of the book, I suppose, one of the disappointing things I found was in chapters 5 and 6, he got into a lot of personal digressions and it became somewhat unscientific. This is okay if it was just going to be I don't personally care what his personal opinions are. They can be interesting, they can be not interesting. But for the book is set out as basically a scientific book, and his personal opinions just aren't that interesting. So he's a scientist, but he's not, and he's writing as a scientist about his personal things, which is like, okay, I don't really give a shit about this. So I felt that bit was a bit unnecessary and took away from my enjoyment. The final part was all about cities and companies. And while he went deep, I feel like he went too deep in this section and just missed out I guess it made me bored in essence. Like the last part of the book, he was getting so deep on, exactly why a city will be like this, exactly why a company is like this. And while he has a lot of graphs and interesting little things in there, overall it just felt like a bit too, it felt like it trailed off a little bit. What I wished more from the book and what there was interesting little tidbits and deep dive into them. So he's got a story of how giving drugs to people, it doesn't necessarily scale with body mass. And they did this experiment with an elephant with LSD back in the day, and ended up giving the elephant, I think it was a couple hundred micrograms or milligrams of LSD. Whereas if they'd done the calculations, they would have realized like, oh no, wait, it's not good to scale with body. It's sort of, it's a sublinear one. So you actually only need to give it like a couple of micrograms. So it overdosed and died, which is a pretty big mistake and, rather sad. But there's all these other interesting little tidbits, such as cities, for example. No matter how big it is, the average commute for a person going in and out from the city is about an hour each day. So half an hour there, half an hour back. And it doesn't matter how good the transportation is. You could have super fast trains. You could have just people walking in. That average commute time stays the same, which I found pretty interesting. Having read some other books on complexity and having an engineering background helped me a lot understanding this as well. I think I would have struggled a bit if it was all just, if I was reading this fresh from, say, like a humanities degree, or if I was just an average layperson reading it. Because I had that background in engineering, a lot of the stuff sort of I knew about already, especially like fractals and some of the things with regards to companies and cities. So yeah, that sort of helped me a bit. In summary, it was a very promising book at the start, but sort of fizzled out towards the end. I felt it just lacked that punch, that thing that would have taken it to another level. Not to say it's bad, but I didn't find it super great either. So I'm giving it a 6.5 out of 10. Which is, it's okay. Worth reading, especially if you're intrigued in, scale and I suppose how cities and companies change throughout time. And my pragmatic idea to take from this book is to investigate a bit more into longevity, especially the caloric restriction. I was quite interested in that, as well as potentially, are there ways to reduce your average heart rate, your heartbeats per day, and I suppose would doing those detract from my own life as well. Fasting is something I already practice, so I'm intrigued by that. I want to know, should I be doing this a lot more often than I currently do? And with the heartbeats, is it potentially better to, while exercising, focus on reducing the heart rate or keeping it at a more steady pace? And will that affect other parts of my life as well, such as my resting heart rate? So that's it for me. The book Scale by Geoffrey West, a good read, not a fantastic read, but a good read. So that's it for today. Karen out.